Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. It's Friday, June 13, 2025, and a week ago last Friday, I posted a video clip out of S4A livestream number 128 titled A Tale of Two Comments, How to Move the US Left Forward to Socialism. And in that clip, we discussed a number of communist parties as well as broader left parties in the US, and my orientation as an individual running a non-party affiliated YouTube channel doing general public-facing Marxist-Leninist education, which includes both the audiobooks and discussions, as well as current events videos and live streams, to this question of what party should people join? How should people who are learning that capitalism is in severe, probably end-stage crisis and starting to take steps to do something about it, how should they get organized? So this is something that I discuss at the end of pretty much every audiobook. Sometimes when I'm recording an audiobook, I don't go into it in full depth at the end of the video, in the closing when we're thanking the patrons and all that kind of thing. But usually I say something to the effect of, we can agitate and educate online, but organizing is something that you have to do locally in your area. That is something that I leave up to you and then ask you to report back to me. How is your organizing going? What kind of experience have you had with different parties, etc.? That's not a decision I'm trying to make for other people, but if we can foster and facilitate that discussion, while I also give my honest opinion on it, that is how I have determined I can be of most use as far as keeping this channel general, public-facing, education-oriented, while making people aware of what options are out there, as well as some of the potential problems with specific organizations. This is not an easy line to walk. What I've basically come up with is, especially for people who lack a lot of experience, just get involved with your local left, find out what organizations are there. Usually there's at least going to be a DSA or a Green Party. You're likely not to have a horrible, controlling, cult-like experience with those, so I feel fairly confident in just sending people out, get to know your comrades. Those aren't communist organizations, but they're probably hubs of local left organizing and activism. And you can probably meet other people there and find other things that are going on. In other words, you shouldn't be trying to get that information from YouTube, but from other communists in your area or other people who you're in touch with online and who can share more specific information about parties. But trying to do this YouTube channel, I'm trying to handle the comments, I'm trying to promote the channel, I'm trying to come up with interesting topics to cover and playlists that we can put together to go into topics in detail. In short, I'm trying to run a Marxist-Leninist YouTube channel that is of maximum use to the real-world movement, and if I get too bogged down in this party versus that party, I think that there's a lot of potential there for the channel to get off course and to get dragged into a lot of drama and so on. That said, I do have certain opinions and can relay certain information. So I want to do that because I really want more than anything to see this movement grow and to take on capitalism effectively, and in the meantime, to immunize people against fascist, imperialist, xenophobic, warmongering propaganda while we get our organizing up to critical mass. So we need to do the anti-imperialist piece and to spread that message, and also do the organizing that can effectively turn the tables on the capitalists and take power, because that's what we're going to have to do at some point. Now, unfortunately, there isn't, as we were discussing in that video, one communist party that I think is the vanguard party. The labor movement, as we were discussing, has been basically hollowed out since the 1960s. It's been in steady decline. And a lot of the communist parties are sort of doing their own thing. They're a study group. They're a pre-party formation, even if some of them are calling themselves a party. But there isn't that much of a tie to the labor movement and the masses in general. It's still kind of separate. That's going to change at some point, especially as more and more people lose confidence that capitalism is a future-oriented system, as happened after 2008 in droves, and I think that there's been a really weak recovery by capitalism since then, and it's headed for another huge crisis, so that we can expect to continue, and we need to further our organizing in anticipation of that, and to get this movement and its organizations ready to absorb and educate a lot of people. We need to create a lot of communists pretty quickly. So that said, in that last video, I was pretty critical of a lot of the parties. We looked at a tier list, which had been made by the Twitter account Communist Polls in 2023. So it didn't have some of the newest and some of the smallest parties or groups on there, but I mentioned that there are criticisms of a lot of these parties. Now, for you as the listener, I've always said, if there's one that speaks to you and you really feel ready to join a democratic centralist communist organization, go for it. but you should go in there knowing its history and with eyes open to all the potential problems and to just be on guard for that, because there are a few things worse than being in a bad party situation, I believe. So while I don't want to turn people off to organizing, far from it, I do want to urge caution. And again, that's why if you don't necessarily feel up to that, I would say just join a big tent group for now, network with local comrades, get involved in the activism, boots on the ground kind of thing, and keep studying Marxism on the side. If there's other people who are part of the left wing of your organization and you think that there's potential there, form a study group with them. That's great. You should definitely do that. And of course, apply what you've learned when things come up for a vote in your organization. Fight the liberal tendencies, fight the tendencies to tell the Democratic Party, which is a fascist collaborating imperialist party, and peeling the US left off of that party is one of the key tasks before us, I believe. Anyway, with that said, I wanted to do some follow-up comments on that video, and I also wanted to comment on some of the current events that have popped up in the last week, which includes in about the last 24 hours, Israel attacking Iran, allegedly with the approval from the US to do so. Not the UN, just the USA, and of course, Iran is now counterattacking, so that is going on as we speak, as I record this. Also, Israel has cut the only internet cable going into Gaza, so Gaza right now is without internet, which is a really worrying prelude to what Israel may be planning to do now that there's going to be less of a possibility for people outside Gaza to see what's going on. Israel is also bombing southern Lebanon again, so a lot of stuff happening there right now. Also, domestically in the United States, we covered the tariff situation, which is sort of on ice for the moment, in livestream number 28, and posted a clip about that titled "Meet Peter Navarro, Anti-China Zealot and Trump's Tariffs quote-unquote mastermind," a fanatical anti-China activist who over a decade ago made a movie and book called Death by China, in which he made all kinds of exaggerated claims, basically blaming everything going wrong in the US with US capitalism, with world capitalism, on China. And whatever you think about China, that is factually inaccurate. And whatever kind of issue there is, a US-led trade war and or military war is definitely not going to help and needs to be vigorously opposed with everything that we have. But basically, Peter Navarro being elevated now to the White House is a bad sign in terms of at least one large faction of the U.S. ruling class adopting these views as kind of their primary strategy. But beyond that, on the domestic front, there is really kind of a major crisis of the U.S. government unfolding right now. Since he got into office, Trump has been doing all kinds of actions which have been legally challenged that he doesn't have the authority to do. Whether it's the tariffs or DOGE or any number of other things, including what is happening in California right now. Long story short, there is a branch of the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after the 9/11 terror attacks, called ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And for the last few months, they have been going into cities around the U.S. and doing these really high-profile, spectacular Gestapo raids, brutalizing people suspected of being undocumented immigrants, and then not giving them due process and shipping them to facilities, for example, in El Salvador. The legality of this has been challenged. In the meantime, there have been protests in a number of cities as people have gotten a coordinated response together, and Los Angeles is kind of ground zero right now for some of the biggest protests, which are largely peaceful and nonviolent. However, the right wing is putting AI-generated slop pictures all over right-wing websites such as Twitter to give the idea that LA is burning to the ground because the protesters are actually rioters. This is a common refrain that you see from troll farms in internet video comment sections, that these are, quote, riots, not protests. It definitely, I think, is a coordinated messaging campaign to portray things that way. That's not the case at all. But anyway, to respond to this manufactured and overblown crisis, Trump activated several thousand National Guard troops, which it was ruled this week he did not have the legal authority to do. If that's going to be done, it's supposed to be done through the governor. So the governor of California got into a battle with Trump. Trump then countered by saying that he was going to have the governor of California arrested. That hasn't happened yet, but they did arrest Senator Alex Padilla, who showed up at the Department of Homeland Security press conference where the Secretary Kristi Noem was saying that they were there to, quote, liberate Los Angeles from the socialists. A truly baffling statement. And there is footage of the senator being wrestled to the ground and arrested. At the same time, Senator Josh Hawley has been sending out intimidation letters reminiscent of actually the kind of thing that the MAGA communists send to accounts that are mean to them on Twitter. The senator's non-binding, open-ended phishing fishing expedition letter was sent to Unión del Barrio, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or PSL, which is one of the parties that we had been discussing in last week's video. It said that they were suspected of giving material support to disorderly conduct and rioting and to hold on to all of their records from the last 6 months. And I want to be super clear here. It's important that we, within the left, and even more specifically within the communist left, engage in constructive criticism and struggle for correct ideas, but that's something we do internally with each other. So whatever your differences with those organizations, it should be clear that there is a third Red Scare going on right now. And something that we know from the first Red Scare is that basically they would just go in to immigrant communities, round people up regardless of their status, and just put them on boats back to Europe indiscriminately. That is exactly what's happening again, and the targeting of organizations like PSL, which have helped to organize some of these protests both now and in the past, the anti-war protests in the War on Terror era, needs to be understood in that light of a third Red Scare, that these are just the first groups that they're targeting. Even if you don't like PSL, they're going to come for somebody you do like really soon. Now, I understand why people would not necessarily have it on their radar to be looking out for something like this, because for a long time, the left has mostly just been ignored. But as capitalism continues to be questioned and the conversation about creating a post-capitalist solution, a transition to socialism, continues to spread as it will keep doing, we are going to get more attention, and people have to be ready with community self-defense, starting with legal defense. And this is something that all the organizations, parties, and groups need to be aware of and make strategies for. Because again, this struggle is just beginning. The Trump administration is coming out guns blazing. There's going to be more communities and people's rights coming under attack, and there's going to be protests, and there's going to be struggle around this. So the more organized you can get now, the better. So I started out talking about that video we posted last week on the parties, and I do have some more thoughts that I wanted to share about that. First, though, let me just mention, there are 2 events coming up that I want to bring to people's attention. You may already be aware of these if you are in a local organization, but in case you're not, tomorrow, 6/14, Saturday, there is the No Kings protest. Now, this is being organized by the 5051 or 50501 movement. This is a very lib movement. I would suspect a lot of Democratic Party involvement in that, so if you do get involved in that, just be aware that it has that bent to it. As you can tell, I think just from the slogan itself, No Kings, I mean, monarchism is not the issue that we are confronting today. I think that that's horrible framing, and that really is just serving to misinform people who are getting involved in that. Monarchism is not the issue. It is fascism, the organized expression of social decay, of late-stage capitalism, advanced monopoly capitalism, or capitalist imperialism. And that political movement is fascism. That is the lens through which to understand the situation in the United States right now, not monarchism. Trump is not a king. He is part of a fascist system. There is also a conference, Socialism 2025, which is coming up in Chicago in a few weeks, July 3rd through 6th. That's being organized by Haymarket Books, and there are many partnering organizations, including the Debt Collective, DSA, Hammer and Hope, Counterpunch, Chicago for Abortion Rights, Solidarity. The list is actually really long. As always, if you have events that you think people should know about, send them in, and I'll see about maybe sharing them with the channel. All right, so that said, let me just conclude with some follow-up comments about the earlier video about the parties. First thing I want to say is there was a comment I made during the video, which was to the effect of that all of the communist parties that I knew of were engaging in some kind of liberalism or had some kind of revisionist tendencies to them. And that was given as a reason why I didn't want to endorse any of them right now. I have to say that the overarching issue is not to get the channel bound up with any particular party in terms of, having the channel's PSL phase or whatever that will go for a certain period of time, and then we'll have to backtrack from that and make corrections or whatever. The furthest that I'm going is to do some of the reading lists that the parties put on their website as far as having a syllabus for prospective members to study as part of the application process or as part of a probationary period in the party, so we can help people not just understand capitalism and the history of the international communist movement, but actually do some work to prepare you to join a party. Which party is up to you, but again, that's multi-purpose stuff that is going to serve a lot of different people and a lot of different groups. So I think that that's fair in terms of contributing to the real world organizing, and again, the organization is on you. That is for you to figure out. If there was one clear party that I thought definitely was the vanguard, that would be a different conversation if I was holding out from, endorsing that party. Again, I don't think we're in that situation right now, and I would like to see just broad-based activity plus Marxist studies, and I'll let you figure out exactly how that's going to manifest, and then we'll have that discussion at that point. But what I wanted to say is it might be too harsh to say that all of the parties are revisionist. Now, a lot of the parties are Trotskyist. That's something that we don't endorse under any circumstances. So that's a complete non-starter. Don't follow Trotsky. He was an unreliable theorist. He was all over the place. And look at our Lenin Against Trotsky playlist or the anti-Trotskyism playlist for a deeper dive into that topic. Next, a lot of the parties are Dengist, or they support the teachings of Deng Xiaoping and the upholding of socialism with Chinese characteristics, so-called. I believe that this is revisionist and that it's really confusing to a lot of first and second year Marxist-Leninists who haven't done as much of the studying. I think, though, that as a general rule, the more you read, the more that is just untenable as far as calling that socialism. It is more like social democracy. Social democracy being confusing because you can get there from two positions. You can either have a pre-revolutionary state, a capitalist state, that comes under pressure to do regulations and introduce some kind of social democratic reforms. Or you can have a socialist country or a country that had a proletarian revolution and then starts to slink backwards into re-allowing capitalism. And so you get kind of a social democratic type of system that way, although with allegedly socialists in charge. Now, there's a difference between China and Russia in that Russia is explicitly imperialist. It had a counter-revolution. It openly declared we are not socialist anymore. It is advanced monopoly capitalist, and it's intending to stay that way indefinitely. They compete with other major powers for the redivision of the world for profit. That is textbook imperialism. And we have an inter-imperialist conflict shaping up right now. China, though, has not had a full counter-revolution in that the Communist Party of China has not been removed from power, but there now are capitalists inside the party, something you wouldn't find in the USSR, for example. And China claims that it will be socialist one day. They will get to a certain point of development, then get rid of their stock market, get rid of all the capitalism, press the socialism button, in other words. And some people take them at their word on that. Others see the growth of capitalism in that country, the bailing out of the United States after 2008, so many other factors, and say, hey, it looks like the political control of capital in that country is growing and growing. Some people going as far as saying it looks like basically if the Kuomintang had just won the war back in 1949. So I grant this is a confusing topic. It confused me for the first few years. However, the more I studied, the more questions I asked, the less satisfying I found the answers that were coming out of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and I became a lot more skeptical of that. And I found the explanations that were given by the skeptics that said, no, they're actually just covertly restoring capitalism on the installment plan. That was making a lot more sense to me. And we have a number of videos on the channel on that topic, including Against Dengism, Dengism, a multi-part one by N.B. Turner called Is China an Imperialist Country? A segment in S4A livestream number 88 on capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and then pieces by Enver Hoxha such as Theory and Practice of the Revolution, which was criticizing the Chinese quote-unquote opening up in the late 70s as it was happening. Anyway, I can't consider a party that is still teaching that to be in good hands, so I definitely can't recommend that or endorse that. That includes CPUSA, FRSO, PSL, and others. I think it's understandable why the parties are in this kind of state following the late 20th century crash out of the 20th century wave of socialism and trying to hang on to what they can from that. But again, it seems to me like, as I've said a number of times over the years of doing this channel, it seems to me more like we need a do-over of recreating that communist vanguard free of that baggage. So those are some of the most common issues of why I can't endorse a party. Again, though, just for tactical reasons, I think it doesn't make sense. And there's an example that it's surprising to me I didn't think of it as I was doing the stream, but there's sort of a perfect example of a group that I kind of was quasi-endorsing for a while, or at least speaking very favorably about, because I thought that they had a correct understanding and a good line on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which for a while in 2022 and 2023, I saw so many individuals and organizations taking what I thought was a horrible, revisionist, lesser evilist approach to what could be the basis of actual World War III. And then that group came out with a horrendous, I mean, it was one of the worst I saw anywhere, lines on the Palestine-Zionism conflict in late 2023 in October after the current phase of that struggle was beginning. And that was really regrettable, and I had to, put out a couple of videos explaining we won't be doing anything more with them. That group, of course, was Politsturm. And the thing is that a lot of their website is actually still good. It's Leninist analysis, and it holds up, but for some reason, they just couldn't apply it to Palestine. But maybe that's what you get when you are pretending to be an anti-revisionist organization, but really are just Brezhnevist. Again, more of that late 20th century communism holdover stuff after it had already crossed into revisionism. But again, just because a party has a bad line on something important doesn't mean that all their analysis is bad. So when I say that these parties are revisionist in some way, I want to underscore that the extent to which I consider them to be such can vary greatly. And there are organizations which, I think for the time being at least, are within an acceptable threshold of what I would consider, questionable positions, which is why I sort of wanted to qualify my statement about that, all of these organizations are revisionist. There are actually some that I think, again, are within an acceptable threshold on important questions. And again, not all questions are of equal importance. But again, I just wanted to qualify that it was maybe an overgeneralization to say all of these groups are revisionist. Some, again, I think are acceptable. But I'm not going to endorse anything at this time. I don't think any group has clearly established itself as the group to follow, even if it has what I consider a pretty good anti-revisionist line. And I just at this point don't want an external group's political fuck-ups to become the problem of this channel. And also, when we say something is revisionist, it doesn't mean everything that group has ever done is worthless, far from it. Also, criticizing China as revisionist doesn't mean that we hate China. I actually happen to like a lot of things about China. However, I'm really concerned that their line is not going to result in socialism. But I don't want that criticism in your mind to give the impression that somehow I think nothing of the struggle or desires of the Chinese people for socialism. Those are different things. All right, couple other things. There are some groups that I didn't mention. As I said, that tier list, which I was not using as an actual tier list, just as a sort of organizing tool, was from 2023, so it didn't include some groups. So some other groups are the Unity Struggle Unity group at unity-struggle-unity.org. I don't know everything that there is to know about this party, but I did like their COVID articles, which we have covered in previous live streams. Another group we have read articles from in previous live streams is the CWP USA, or Communist Workers Platform USA. Others in the comments mention the MCU, or Maoist Communist Union. I really don't know anything about them other than a few people mentioning them in the comments. There is also the IWW, or Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, and we have some IWW labor organizing manuals on the channel. This is a labor union which tends to be very anarchist-leaning, but in terms of the actual labor organizing, they have some practical skill-building sessions that you can learn from. Someone else mentioned Workers Strike Back, although from what I saw, this is a Trotskyite group, and therefore on my no list. There were also a couple of comments from younger people, a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old, saying, I'm not sure there's anything I can do to organize now. And definitely for now, you can just continue to study on your own or with friends using online resources, or as many people pointed out, there are organizations specifically set up which are like the youth chapter, like YDSA is for younger people. The Greens also have young eco-socialists at yesgp.org, and other groups will have similar. Somebody pointed out that it can be hard to organize the youth-oriented groups, but that's really the case with any group, whether it's for youth or not. Also, there was a thing that I didn't know what it was on the list that said Edward. And I thought, is this an Edward Bernstein group? I had no idea what that was. And I'll just point out in my defense, no one in the chat seemed to know what it was either. But people in the comments pointed out that is Red Guard, just cropped badly, a now defunct Gonzaloist organization. And then finally, there were a number of people in the comments saying that they were in CPUSA and that no one had ever told them to vote Democrat. One of them even said that they were a, quote, party leader, although they did not say where or at what level, or I don't even know if this is true. But they said that, well, the CPUSA's line is actually not to vote Democrat, it's just to hashtag vote against fascism. So as long as they vote for somebody who isn't Trump, but that includes you can vote for the Democrats. That's what they were tasked with overseeing as their party leader, was just everybody under them needed to vote for somebody who wasn't Trump, including fascist collaborating parties like the Democrats. And here's the thing about that. don't insult our intelligence. Anybody, and I've done videos about this, we've talked about it in live streams, it's come up many times. Basically, they have this standing vote against fascism campaign. First of all, terrible slogan. Second, if you actually read their vote against fascism stuff, yes, they do, in the most weaselly way, usually avoid explicitly endorsing the Democratic Party. However, the entire slant of the article is such that it implies voting for the Democrats is the acceptable, just, and really urgent thing to do. Co-chair Joe Sims goes on at length about this, and a previous chair from 2014 to 2019 was heavily involved in Obama's Senate election campaign, even being the precinct captain. So this is an issue with CPUSA tailing the Democratic Party, pushing the idea of a popular front against fascism with a fascist collaborating party. So again, this is something that we have covered in previous years, and I'm sure we will keep covering it, but the, 3 or 4 people who came into the comments to say, CPUSA member here, they didn't tell me to vote Democrat. Okay, then I guess it's not a systemic problem in that party then, since it happened to pass you by somehow. Meanwhile, another commenter adds that they were in the Tanky Bunker Discord server for CPUSA and got kicked out for criticizing Joe Biden. This is something that CPUSA people got into many fights on Twitter about that I saw and was part of, so it's a long-standing issue and one that we will undoubtedly revisit in the future. Anyway, lots going on right now. Just wanted to make this video to comment on some of it. I'm glad that we had that discussion because this is something, the question of parties, organizations, and groups in relation to this channel that I've been struggling to, not really struggling to articulate on my end, but struggling to have some kind of a clear understanding from the audience about, and I feel like we finally achieved that. So here's to a future where we might not have to struggle for that understanding quite as much. Anyway, keep up your organizing, keep up your studies, keep up your struggle for correct ideas within your organizations, and we will see you in the next video.